The movie is set 1 week before Halloween. A timid 8-year-old boy named Peter lives with his overbearing parents in a country house, and due to the pressure his parents inflicted on him, Peter has no friends or any social life. He is often bullied at school and would spend his free time on piano lessons with his mother, Carol. One night, he wakes up to strange noises in his room. It sounds like someone was scraping and pounding the walls from the inside. As the intense fear starts to grip Peter, he rushes near the doorway and turns the lights on before looking through his open window. The swing can be seen moving, though he cannot see anyone around. It might be because of the wind or animals like squirrels that decided to play near the swing. After seeing the door of the barn move from the wind, Peter turns his attention to the wall in his room. His floorboard creaks as he slowly walks toward it, in unison with the muffled knocks. He stands face to face with the wall and presses his ears on it, trying to hear the sound properly. When he cannot hear anything, he lifts his hands and knocks on the wall, hoping to get a response from whoever created the noise. On his first try, nothing. But on his second, he receives an answer he did not hope to get. Someone appears to have knocked from inside. He quickly backs away in shock and then goes to his parents' room to tell them what happened. Peter nudges her sleeping mother and tells her that he heard strange noises in his room. Carol walks hand in hand with Peter to his room and checks the wall herself, but there is nothing. No strange noises or anything. The house is rather old, so she says that it's completely normal for sudden bumps to occur at night. She then tucks him to bed and tells him that what he hears is only part of his big imagination. To allow him a good night's sleep, she convinces him that those scary things are all just in his head. The next morning, Peter prepares for school and waits for the school bus. It's not even over a minute. Yet the other students already start making fun of him. They threaten to do more during their recess. At school, the class's new substitute teacher, Miss Devon, is introduced by their principal. During recess, Peter stays in the classroom, afraid that the bullies will harm him again if he goes to the cafeteria. Miss Devon is startled when she notices that Peter is still in the classroom. After learning that Peter has no friends, she tells him to help her with the Halloween decorations instead. Peter slumps on his desk when a spider suddenly appears. He jolts backward in fear. Miss Devon rushes to his aid and helps him take the spider out of the room. After school, Peter sits at the dinner table with his parents, Carol and Mark. He breaks the silence by asking them what he's going to be for Halloween. All the kids from school are going to do trick-or-treating, but it seems like his parents are against it. Carol explains they are not like other parents who would let their children out at night. To back up their decision, Mark proceeds to tell him a story about the little girl who went missing on Halloween in their neighborhood a few years ago, before Peter was even born. Nobody knows where the girl went, she just disappeared. Up to this day, that incident has brought fear and trauma to the residents. Carol mentions that talking about it brings back the trauma she felt during that night. Peter asks if the same thing is going to happen to him, but Carol assures him that it's not going to, ever. They will not let it. When bedtime comes, Peter leaves a flashlight pointed at the wall to help with his fear. After some time, he dozes off. Unbeknownst to him, something starts bulging from inside the wall, which also slowly disappears before he opens his eyes. All of a sudden, he hears rattling sounds coming from the wall again. Then a voice of a young girl speaks to him, calling his name. He immediately jolts out of his bed and yells for his dad to come, while staring at the wall. Seconds later, Mark enters the room and questions Peter, who tells him that it happened again. Mark believes those were just rats, so the next morning, he lets Peter tag along in putting pesticides throughout the house. Though Peter is somewhat against extinguishing the rats, Mark assures him that it is the right thing to do. Sometimes they need to make tough decisions to protect their family. At school, Miss Devon then allows the class to create a painting for Halloween while she reads them a story. After seeing a disturbing portrait of Peter's room, she decides to stop by Peter's house uninvited. She's just concerned about his well-being and wants to make sure that everything's all right. However, in Carol's defense, Peter is fine, and that a teacher should call them first before making unnecessary visits. Miss Devon then hands over the painting to Carol, who confirms if Peter drew it. Carol explains that the drawing might be influenced by Peter's imagination, when he constantly wakes them up every night due to his flights of fancy. She then gives her appreciation for the concern and goes back inside the house without inviting Miss Devon inside. The teacher seems a little hesitant about Carol's explanation, but decides to dismiss it since she cannot do anything more than check up on her students. Carol storms into Peter's room and asks him to explain his drawing. She appears frustrated, almost angry. Peter says that it was just a drawing, nothing else. Carol's frustration increases and demands to know the reason why he asks for help, but Peter says he doesn't. After getting no further explanation from his son, Carol prepares to leave the room. Then, under his breath, Peter says that someone else is asking for help. Though inaudible, Carol hears him. She stops and asks again, but Peter continues to deny that there is meaning behind the drawing. Before leaving, Carol warns him that his imagination may get him into trouble one day. At midnight, Peter wakes up to a voice of a girl speaking to him. He tells her to be quiet and tries to convince himself that she's only part of his imagination. The girl tells her if he doesn't want a friend, she can leave. The girl prepares to leave, and with the strange footsteps inside, the wall starts rescinding. Peter stops her and agrees to communicate. At school, the class paints pumpkins for Halloween and Miss Devon compliments Peter's work, saying that it was her favorite among them. Brian the bully overhears their conversation and decides to destroy Peter's pumpkin after school. Peter walks away in sadness and spends his time at night crying in his bed. The girl on the wall is there for him. He explains that Brian bullies him every day, and the girl tells him he believes that Peter is strong enough to stand up for himself. So the next day, after Brian gives him a pumpkin as a forced apology, Peter follows the girl's advice to make Brian recognize his strength and to make him afraid of him. He sneaks behind Brian and his friend during recess and pushes him off the stairs, inflicting him with a broken leg. After getting expelled from school, Carol and Mark demand an explanation from him. They cannot believe why Peter could have done it. He has no signs of any violent behavior before. He explains that he didn't mean for Brian to fall off the stairs, which only triggers Mark. He doesn't believe in using violence to solve their problems, so he's having a hard time accepting his son's behavior. Carol interrupts him and reveals the drawing. She apologizes for not telling him about it immediately, but Mark is so overwhelmed by his emotions, he shouts at Peter. Peter explains that he heard a girl talking to him, but Mark insists he did not. It was all in his head. Mark momentarily calms and tells Peter he's grounded. By that, Mark means that Peter will not be sleeping in his room, but in the basement. Mark pulls the refrigerator aside, revealing the door to the basement concealed behind it. Carol is against this idea, but she cannot contradict the will of her husband. She assures Peter that they are just doing it because they love him. After having Peter sit on the floor of the basement, the couple leaves and locks the basement door. Peter tries to start a conversation with the girl, but he receives no response. He falls asleep with a heavy heart. At school, the principal confronts Miss Devon for going to Peter's house and tells her she should not do something like that unless Peter is talking about things not meant for his age. Other than that, they are not allowed to intervene. She then mentions feeling a little off about Carol, so the principal narrates the story of the girl who disappeared years ago in Peter's neighborhood. He justifies Carol's behavior as just being protective. Meanwhile, Peter wakes up and notices the chain lying nearby. He pulls the chains and discovers a pit covered by a grate. Then, he looks through it and sees a stuffed toy at the bottom. Later, Miss Devon decides to dig deeper into the missing case and browses the internet for any information. Afterward, she starts checking the papers of the students for their math quizzes. She notices Peter's paper. Failing to ward off her concern, she writes her phone number on the paper and personally hands it over to Carol. As an excuse, she says that Peter only has little mistakes on the quiz, and she just thought of giving it to Carol, who thanks her for coming by. When Carol is about to get back inside, Miss Devon tries to stop her. She wants to say something, but their conversation is cut short when Mark suddenly appears at the doorstep. He greets Miss Devon and Carol introduces them to each other. Then, Mark thanks her and invites her inside for some coffee. Carol locks the door with some keys and hangs the paper on the fridge, while Mark guides Miss Devon to the dining table. He places the hammer on the countertop and pours their guest a cup of coffee. Miss Devon notices that Mark's arm is bleeding, so he explains that he was doing some remodeling. A nail might have pricked his arm. Miss Devon expresses her concern about Peter's schooling. Mark assures her that Peter will be getting the same education in their home, with Carol as Peter's teacher. For Mark, family is what Peter needs. Miss Devon agrees, but before she goes, she asks to see Peter to personally say goodbye. But Carol and Mark refuse. Carol starts to question why she is acting strange toward their son, to which Miss Devon explains that she just wanted to make sure he's all right. Carol starts to get frustrated and yells at her for sounding like their son is in danger in their own house. Peter hears the commotion outside and listens to them near the basement door. He starts banging on the door, yelling for help, but the sound of the washing machine and Carol's voice mutes the noise he makes. Finally sensing danger, Miss Devon apologizes and starts walking toward the front door when the washing machine stops. Peter kicks the door again, prompting Miss Devon to turn around. However, Mark is in front of her with the hammer. She demands to know the source of the noise, but Mark insists it was just the washing machine, which starts working normally again. He then guides Miss Devon out of the house. At night, Carol bakes pumpkin pies for Peter and lets him out of the basement. She bathes him and tells him he'll be studying at home from now on. He admits his mistakes and Mark tells him they have forgiven him. Afterward, they tuck him into bed in his room. As soon as Peter hears the sound of his parents' bedroom door closing, he stands up and approaches the wall. He tries to communicate with the girl by knocking on it. A few knocks later, the girl responds. She expresses her worries and Peter explains he's been locked up in the basement by his parents. The girl seems to know something and she warns Peter to be careful around them. They are not what he thinks they are. Peter asks to see her, so the girl instructs him to look through the hole at the bottom of the wall, behind the wallpaper. He cannot see anything since it's pitch black inside. He grabs a ball and rolls it down the hole. All of a sudden, someone peeks through the same hole. Her face is dark and only her eyes can be seen. In shock, Peter backs away and demands to know who was inside the wall. Turns out the girl is his sister, and she has been waiting for him to grow up, big enough to move the huge clock on the wall to set her free. Peter refuses to listen, but the girl explains their parents are evil and Peter's time is coming. Afraid, he hides beneath his blanket. Suddenly, he hears someone knocking on his door. While he calls out to his mom, the rug starts moving on its own. The doorknob slowly turns until the door opens, revealing the hallway toward another room. When he calls out hello, a girl rapidly passes across the hallway and the lights go out. As he anticipates someone to attack him from the dark, Mark speaks. There, on the corner, he's standing still, eyes blinking rapidly, and blaming Peter for what happened to Carol. Suddenly, the lights are back and Carol is in the hallway looking possessed. She bolts toward Peter but the lights go out again. The footsteps momentarily stop but Carol emerges from the hallway. This time, she's nowhere near what she normally looks like. She then jumps over Peter and grabs him. Peter finally wakes up in the arms of his mother, trying to calm him. He realizes what his dream was about but decides to keep it to himself. That night, Peter learns from his sister that their parents have already ended the lives of many. They hated her. Peter refuses to listen but his sister mentions something that's buried in their garden. She volunteers to tell him exactly where. The next morning, Peter starts digging in their backyard, while Carol emerges from the door behind the clock with a pitcher. On her way back to the kitchen, she notices Peter's ball and enters his room to return it. Just then, the shovel hits something. Peter's eyes widen. The sudden change in his expression mirrors the sheer magnitude of shock that flows through his entire body. He sees a human skull. He is jolted back to his senses when Carol calls out to him from his bedroom window, prompting him to hide the skull. Carol emerges from the house and asks him what he was doing. That time, Peter manages to convince her that he just wants to carve some pumpkins for Halloween. While Carol carves the pumpkins in the kitchen, his sister recounts what happened the night a girl disappeared in their neighborhood. It was Halloween. She explains that the girl saw her when she asked for help, prompting their parents to take her life. Peter promises to get her sister out of the wall, then pulls out his test paper with Miss Devon's number written on it. He plans to ask for her help. He sneaks into his parents' room and gives Miss Devon a call, asking for help. However, before he can explain everything, Carol catches him. The phone rings and Carol answers it, telling Miss Devon that Peter might have missed her and that is all. Carol greets her with a happy Halloween before dropping the call. In anger, Carol forces Peter back to his room where she discovers the hole in the wall. Her demeanor changes. She starts tracing her steps back to the other room, asking Peter what his sister told him. After the clock rings, she warns Peter that whatever's going to happen is his fault. She tells him to wait until his father returns, then locks herself in the room where the clock is. That night, Peter wakes up to the voice of his sister telling him that their parents plan to take their lives, so he needs to do something. He walks down the stairs and sees his parents arguing. Carol senses his presence and he immediately makes his way back to his room while Mark follows. He pretends to be asleep but Mark knows he's awake. He tells Peter to get a good night's sleep and tomorrow they need to do something in the garden, which is burying their rotten crops. The night of Halloween comes. Their family shares dinner, a simple pumpkin soup. Mark and Carol start eating, but Mark notices that something tastes off. Carol takes a couple of spoonfuls more until Mark realizes that it smells like something else. He turns his attention to Peter, who hasn't eaten even a single drop of soup. That's when he realizes that Peter has laced the food with pesticides. He becomes aggressive and yells at Peter before telling Carol to call 911. However, the telephone cord has been cut. His stomach starts to hurt and in a few seconds, he starts vomiting a dark substance until he falls on the floor. Peter slowly backs away in fear. Carol grabs a knife and chases Peter on the stairs. She manages to stop him midway, but starts vomiting the same substance. When she attacks Peter, he pushes her to defend himself. Carol falls with her bones cracking from the impact. Just then, the clock rings. Peter approaches Carol, who turns out to have accidentally stabbed from the fall. He then grabs the keys. Carol, who is barely breathing, tells him not to let his sister out, but Peter refuses to listen. Peter enters his parents' bedroom and his sister asks him to push the clock away from the wall. It reveals a small door, enough for a toddler to pass through standing. His sister then asks him if he can open it, to which he confirms. Peter nervously approaches the door and inserts the key. With a swift turn, he hears the lock loosening. The sudden click of the lock startles him and he immediately backs away, waiting for his sister to finally come out. The door creaks as it slowly opens. The camera focuses on the dark void inside until a pair of glowing eyes appear. Peter gasps in shock and his feet bring him to his room. Turns out his sister is not human, but an ominous being who laughs like a devil. Her laughter resounds throughout the house like a nail, piercing through the ears. Peter blocks the door as she emerges from the void. Her hands resemble those of zombies, not a hint of humanity. She stops by Peter's door, asking him what he feels watching his parents' demise. Her sweet, angelic voice is now replaced by a raspy, demonic one, like an old lady. It appears she manipulated Peter into helping her escape the prison created by his parents, and she was the one responsible for the passing of the girl who was buried in their garden. Peter's parents have been hiding her since. Just then, Brian and his cousins ring the doorbell for trick or treat. They want to take revenge for what Peter did to Brian. Dressed in their Halloween costumes and equipped with weapons, the group waits outside the house, challenging Peter to face them. However, the demonic being hears them, pulls Carol's body aside, then opens the door to welcome her guests, or most likely, her victims. The group willingly enters the house, unaware of the danger they will have to face inside. Brian's cousin starts looking for Peter in his room while the others start destroying the family pictures and everything they feel like ruining downstairs. Peter, who managed to hide underneath his bed beforehand, tries to control his breathing, hoping he will not be found. However, his pursuer finds him downstairs. One of them finds the mess in the kitchen from when Mark vomited blood on the table. The other starts pounding the piano into pieces, unaware that Peter's demonic sister is walking on the ceiling nearby. He is about to leave. Then he hears one of the piano keys play on its own. On top of the piano is a lump of hair. When he approaches it to check, she pulls him underneath the piano and snuffs him out while he screams. Blood splatters on the floor. The scream grabs everyone's attention, including Brian, who sees Carol's gruesome state. The front door suddenly closes and the others rushes toward Brian, asking for help. Brian watches in horror while his cousin is getting hammered repeatedly onto the floor. She then pulls him back and that's the last time Brian sees him. Suddenly, the demonic being appears, scurrying on the ceiling. After moving backward in shock, Brian looks up to see her face. His loud agonizing screams can be heard from upstairs, alerting Brian's surviving cousin. The thuds cease just as the screaming stops. He calls out Brian's name, unaware of what is happening downstairs. However, calling him proves fruitless. All of a sudden, she attacks. And the last thing that can be heard from the house is the painful screams of her victims. But she's not done yet. While Peter hides under his bed, looking directly at the hallway, she takes her victim and repeatedly slams him to the walls. Peter can hear the sound of flesh ripping, and the next thing he sees is the headless body of the man appearing from the other room. He covers his mouth in shock, trying to remain calm while hyperventilating from the horrendous sight in front of him. She then approaches Peter and tells him the story of how she came to be. When she was born, their parents screamed in disgust. They hated her so much that Mark created a pit and cage to keep her locked up. Unlike her, Peter was their favorite. While he slept in a warm bed, she learned how to climb, how to bite, and how to basically survive until the day she can use Peter to free herself. She carves a pumpkin with the man's head inside and gives it to Peter before locking him up in the same cage she was kept through the years. Just then, Miss Devon arrives. There, she hears the girl crying and tries to approach it, thinking it's Peter. When she sees the scene in the kitchen, she pulls out her phone to call the police, but the girl lures her using her hair. Suddenly, the girl scratches her leg, causing her to fall on the floor. She crawls toward the front door, passing through Brian's body. When she sees the girl appearing from the kitchen, she grabs a fire poker and goes for the door. However, she finds it locked. Suddenly, she hears Peter's voice, telling her to run. She decides to follow his voice upstairs. She finds him through the hole in his room, telling her to go, but she refuses to leave him. Before Peter's sister enters the room, she manages to barricade the door. Peter explains that the being is his sister, who then rapidly crawls into the cage to go after him. Miss Devon uses the fire poker to break the wall open. She pulls Peter out of the wall, who then grabs the keys before they run downstairs. Peter manages to open the door, but his sister grabs his head and pulls him back into the house, locking Miss Devon out. Later, Peter wakes up inside the pit where he finds his sister's teddy bear. On the tag, the name Sarah is written. She then appears on top of the pit. Sarah crawls down to him and explains that she was born a monster. Just then, Miss Devon calls out to him, but Sarah covers his mouth. Miss Devon eventually reaches the pit and swears to finish Sarah off if she hurts Peter. Suddenly, Sarah tackles her. When Sarah is about to take her life, Peter pulls the hair hanging on the pit. He uses it as a rope to climb up. Screaming, he pours all his strength to pull Sarah while Miss Devon strikes her with the fire poker. Sarah falls back into the pit, and they manage to lock her up. However, despite having stayed with Miss Devon after his parents passed, Peter still sees Sarah's shadow. She promises to be with him, always.